He had spent 20 years building luxury hotels for the richest people in America, but the woman eating cold leftovers alone at 2:13 in the morning was about to teach him something money never could. The marble hallways of the Callaway Grand Hotel shimmered beneath soft golden chandeliers as the final guests drifted out of the ballroom after another million-dollar charity gala. Crystal glasses clinked softly in the distance. Expensive perfume lingered in the air. Men in tailored tuxedos laughed beside women wrapped in diamonds and silk, while valet attendants lined up black SUVs outside beneath the cold Chicago rain. Ethan Callaway stood near the lobby windows, silent and exhausted. At 42, he was the youngest billionaire hotel owner in the Midwest, respected by investors, feared by competitors, and photographed constantly beside celebrities who barely remembered his name the next morning. His navy suit fit perfectly. His platinum watch reflected the chandelier light. To everyone watching, Ethan Callaway looked like a man who had everything. But as he loosened his tie and stared at the rain sliding down the glass, something inside him felt strangely hollow. Another gala. Another room filled with fake smiles and empty conversations pretending to change the world while thousands of dollars in untouched food sat abandoned in silver trays upstairs. He exhaled slowly. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath as a waiter carried out another untouched platter of filet mignon toward the kitchen disposal area. Ethan had grown up poor in Milwaukee. His mother once worked double shifts cleaning motel rooms just to keep heat running through brutal Wisconsin winters. He remembered nights eating canned soup beside a flickering space heater while his mother smiled through exhaustion, pretending everything was fine. Maybe that was why waste bothered him more than it bothered rich people born into comfort. He stepped away from the ballroom and wandered down the employee corridor in silence, avoiding security staff who straightened nervously whenever they recognized him. Tonight, he didn't want conversations. He didn't want business reports. He wanted quiet. The farther he walked, the dimmer the lights became. Polished marble transitioned into plain tile floors near the service elevators. Somewhere in the distance, a dishwasher hummed steadily. Then Ethan stopped walking. Through the half-open kitchen doorway, he noticed a woman sitting alone beneath a flickering fluorescent light. She wore a faded gray cardigan over a hotel housekeeping uniform. Her brown hair was loosely tied back, and exhaustion rested visibly beneath her eyes. In front of her sat a paper plate holding half a cold steak, a spoonful of mashed potatoes, and a dinner roll wrapped carefully in a napkin. Ethan frowned slightly. The woman cut the steak slowly into tiny pieces as though trying to make the meal last longer. Outside the small kitchen window, rain tapped softly against the glass while the giant luxury hotel around her slowly fell asleep. She didn't notice him standing there. Not at first. Ethan watched quietly as she picked up the dinner roll and gently placed half of it into a plastic container beside her bag. Saving it for later, he realized. Something about the image hit him harder than he expected. Millions of dollars moved through this building every week. Wealthy guests complained when imported champagne wasn't chilled exactly right. Influencers demanded custom flower arrangements in suites costing $3,000 a night. And yet here sat one exhausted woman eating leftovers alone like she was afraid someone might take the food away. Then she quietly whispered something to herself that made Ethan freeze completely. "Food shouldn't be wasted," she said softly, almost like a prayer. "Some people would thank God for this much." The room went silent except for the rain. Ethan stared at her, unable to look away. There was no bitterness in her voice. No self-pity. No anger. Just gratitude. Real gratitude. The kind he hadn't heard in years. Slowly, he stepped into the doorway. The woman looked up suddenly, startled. Her blue eyes widened the moment she noticed the stranger in the expensive suit watching her from the shadows. Embarrassment flushed across her face instantly. She began standing quickly. "I'm sorry, sir," she said nervously. "I was just about to clean this up." But Ethan didn't answer right away. Because for the first time in a very long time, the richest man in the building had absolutely no words. Clara Bennett lowered her eyes immediately, embarrassed to have been seen at all. Years of working invisible jobs had taught her that wealthy men in expensive suits rarely looked at people like her unless there was a complaint coming next. She quickly reached for the paper plate and folded the napkin over the cold steak as though hiding evidence of something shameful. "I can throw it away if it looks bad," she said softly. "I know employees are not supposed to eat guest leftovers." Ethan remained standing near the doorway, strangely unable to move. The fluorescent light above her buzzed faintly, casting pale reflections across the stainless steel counters while rain continued sliding down the kitchen window behind her. Everything about the scene felt painfully small compared to the luxury upstairs. Yet somehow it felt more honest than the entire gala he had just escaped from. "You were going to throw it away anyway?" Ethan finally asked quietly. Clara nodded once. "Most of the trays go into the dumpster after events." Ethan glanced toward the untouched food carts lined beside the prep station. Prime steak, roasted vegetables, gourmet desserts arranged perfectly on silver trays that cost more than some families spend on groceries in a month. "I would never touch guest tables." There was no defensiveness in her voice, only quiet dignity. Ethan slowly stepped farther into the room. "What is your name?" "Clara, sir. Clara Bennett." "How long have you worked here, Clara?" "Almost 3 years." Ethan studied her more carefully now. She looked exhausted in the way only working-class exhaustion reveals itself. Not dramatic, not loud, just heavy. The kind that settles into someone's shoulders after too many double shifts and sleepless nights. Her housekeeping shoes were worn along the edges. Her cardigan sleeves had been stitched carefully by hand near the wrists. Yet despite everything, she sat straight with a calmness that surprised him. Upstairs, billionaires constantly demanded respect. This woman carried it naturally without asking anyone for it. Clara carefully pushed the plastic container closer to her bag, trying not to seem greedy. Ethan noticed immediately. "Saving some for later?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "For my mother." Ethan blinked once. "Your mother?" Clara nodded slowly. "She has been sick since winter. Hospital bills got expensive after her second surgery." She gave a small apologetic smile, like someone embarrassed for struggling financially. "Medication costs more than rent sometimes." The room grew quiet again. Ethan looked away briefly toward the dark hallway beyond the kitchen. Somewhere upstairs, faint laughter echoed from drunken guests still lingering near the ballroom bar. The contrast felt almost cruel. Clara gently folded her hands together on the table. "I hope I am not causing trouble." Ethan looked back at her. Trouble? A faint sadness crossed her face. Most managers do not like seeing staff eat leftovers. They say it looks unprofessional. Ethan stared at her for several long seconds. Then he pulled out the metal chair across from her and sat down quietly. Clara looked genuinely startled. Men like Ethan Calloway did not sit in employee kitchens at 2 in the morning beside housekeeping staff. Not in hotels like this. Not in America's luxury world where status separated people more effectively than locked doors. Ethan loosened his tie completely now and glanced at the cold steak on her plate. "Did you work the gala tonight?" His executives upstairs constantly complained during 40-minute board meetings held in leather conference rooms overlooking the city skyline. Yet this woman worked 16-hour shifts and still sounded grateful for cold leftovers wrapped in napkins. He suddenly remembered his mother again. The motel uniforms. The tired eyes. The way she used to smile while pretending canned soup tasted good because she did not want him to feel poor. Something tightened painfully in his chest. Clara noticed him staring silently and looked down awkwardly. "I am sorry if this looks pathetic." Ethan answered immediately. "It does not." She looked surprised by the firmness in his voice. Ethan glanced toward the untouched trays again. "Honestly," he said quietly, "the pathetic part is how much food this place wastes every night." Clara studied him now with curiosity instead of fear. For the first time since he walked into the kitchen, she seemed to realize this stranger might not be like the others upstairs. But before either of them could say another word, heavy footsteps suddenly echoed down the hallway outside the kitchen. And the moment Clara heard that voice approaching, all the color drained from her face. The people who humiliate others the fastest are often the ones most terrified of being exposed themselves. The footsteps grew louder against the tile hallway until a tall man in a Navy management suit appeared at the kitchen entrance holding a clipboard beneath one arm. Richard Holloway, the overnight operations manager, stopped instantly the moment he saw Clara sitting at the employee table. His sharp gray eyes narrowed with immediate irritation. Then his attention shifted toward Ethan sitting across from her, though the dim lighting prevented him from recognizing the owner immediately. "What is going on here?" Richard demanded sharply. Clara stood so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "I am sorry, Mr. Holloway," she said quietly. "I already cleaned my section. I was just leaving." Richard barely looked at her. His attention locked onto the half-eaten plate on the table. The cold steak. the wrapped dinner roll, the plastic container beside her bag. His expression hardened instantly. Are those guest leftovers? Clara swallowed nervously. They were already cleared from the ballroom kitchen. Richard let out a short laugh, filled with open disgust. Unbelievable. Ethan remained silent, watching carefully now. Richard stepped farther into the room with the confidence of a man who enjoyed having authority over exhausted employees who could not fight back. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? He snapped at Clara. We run a 5-star luxury property, not a homeless shelter. Clara lowered her eyes immediately. I am sorry. Sorry does not fix appearances, Richard continued coldly. What if a guest walked in here and saw housekeeping staff digging through leftovers like scavengers? The room went silent except for the buzzing fluorescent light overhead. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Clara reached for the plate carefully. I can throw it away. Obviously you are throwing it away now, Richard replied sharply. This is exactly why employees need boundaries. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Food was already being discarded. Richard glanced toward him impatiently. And you are? Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair. Just someone wondering why perfectly good food bothers you more than employees working 16-hour shifts. Richard's eyes narrowed immediately. Sir, with all respect, you do not understand hospitality standards. Ethan held his gaze evenly. Maybe I understand them better than you think. Richard ignored the comment completely and turned back toward Clara. How many times have you done this? Clara looked confused. What? Taken food from this kitchen. Only food already cleared for disposal, she answered softly. Richard shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. This is exactly the problem with staff these days. Give people 1 inch, and suddenly they think rules do not apply to them. Richard pointed toward the container near her bag. And what exactly is that? Clara hesitated. Bread for my mother. Richard laughed again, louder this time. Of course it is. Ethan's expression darkened. A hush settled across the kitchen. Even 2 line cooks near the prep station had stopped pretending not to listen. Everyone could feel the tension now. Richard folded his arms across his chest. Let me make something very clear, Clara. Employees taking leftovers creates liability issues, sanitation concerns, and frankly, terrible optics. Clara nodded quietly. Yes, sir. Do you know what guests pay to stay here? Richard continued. Some suites upstairs cost $4,000 a night. We cannot have staff behaving like this behind the scenes. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. For $1,000 suites. Yet this man was humiliating an exhausted woman over discarded food worth maybe $20. Clara slowly reached for the plate again. I understand. Richard pointed toward the trash bin near the sink. Throw it out. For one brief moment, Clara looked down at the cold steak and the carefully wrapped dinner roll inside the container beside her bag. Something painful flickered through her eyes. Not anger, not shame, just disappointment. Like someone already exhausted from life, finding out the world still had one more humiliation waiting before sunrise. Then quietly, without arguing, she stood and walked toward the trash can. Ethan watched her every step. The room had gone completely silent now. And when Clara lifted the untouched bread slowly over the garbage bin with trembling fingers, something inside Ethan Calloway changed forever. The strongest people are often the ones who stay gentle even after life gives them every reason not to. Clara stood motionless beside the trash bin, the wrapped dinner roll trembling slightly in her hand, while the fluorescent kitchen light cast pale shadows across her tired face. Richard Holloway watched her with cold impatience, clearly expecting immediate obedience. Well, he said sharply, we do not have all night. Ethan remained seated at the metal table, but his eyes never left Clara. He noticed the way she stared at the bread for one brief second before lowering her gaze again. That single dinner roll was not luxury. It was not greed. It was breakfast for a sick mother waiting in a tiny apartment somewhere while rain hammered the Chicago streets outside. Clara slowly nodded. Yes, sir. Then quietly, with the kind of dignity that only comes from surviving hardship too long, she lowered the bread toward the garbage bin. Stop. Ethan's voice cut through the room instantly. Clara froze mid-motion. Richard turned around sharply. Excuse me. Ethan stood slowly from the chair now, his expression calm but unreadable. I said stop. The kitchen fell silent again. One of the line cooks quietly stepped backward toward the prep station, sensing something important unfolding. Richard forced a tight smile. Sir, this is an employee matter. Ethan walked toward Clara carefully, then reached out and took the wrapped dinner roll gently from her hand before placing it back beside her bag. Clara looked stunned. Richard's face tightened immediately. "With all respect," he said, "hotel policy exists for a reason." Ethan looked at him directly now. "And humanity should exist before policy." Richard let out a short, uncomfortable laugh. "Presentation," he said slowly, "does not mean humiliating exhausted workers over discarded food." Clara immediately tried to calm the situation. "It is okay," she whispered softly. "I understand the rules." Ethan turned toward her, surprised again by the absence of anger in her voice. Most people in her position would have exploded with humiliation by now. But Clara only looked embarrassed that conflict existed at all. Richard crossed his arms. "People need to know their place in a business like this." The words hung heavily in the room. Ethan's eyes darkened immediately. Clara lowered her head again, as though she had heard phrases like that her entire life. The billionaire stared at Richard for several silent seconds. Then he asked quietly, "Do you know what your employees say about you after midnight?" Richard blinked. "Excuse me." Ethan stepped beside the prep counter. "I walk through my properties more than you realize." Richard shifted uncomfortably now. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean," Ethan replied calmly, "that fear keeps places running temporarily, keeps them running forever." The room went still. Clara looked up slowly. Something about Ethan's voice had changed. There was authority in it now. Real authority. Not the loud kind desperate managers performed in front of employees. Quiet authority. The kind people obey instinctively. Richard noticed it too. His confidence began slipping almost immediately. "Sir, I apologize if this situation appears harsh, but standards matter here." Ethan nodded once. "They absolutely do." Then he looked directly at Clara. "How many breaks did you get during your 16-hour shift tonight?" Clara hesitated nervously. Richard answered first. "Employees are given legally required." I asked Clara. Silence. Clara swallowed carefully. 1 15-minute break. Ethan's jaw tightened again. "In 16 hours. Richard immediately stepped forward defensively. "We were understaffed because 2 employees called out." Ethan looked around the kitchen slowly now. The exhausted workers. The dented coffee machine. The stale fluorescent lighting humming above employees who kept this billion-dollar property functioning while executives upstairs toasted champagne beneath chandeliers. Suddenly Ethan saw everything differently. Not as an owner reviewing operations. As a son remembering his mother coming home exhausted after cleaning motel rooms until her hands cracked from chemicals. He looked back at Clara. "Did you eat dinner before your shift?" "Tomorrow morning," he said softly. "I want every employee food policy in this hotel brought directly to my office." The silver crest of Callaway International reflected beneath the fluorescent lights while the billionaire's name sat engraved across the bottom in unmistakable lettering. Ethan Callaway, founder and chief executive officer. The overnight manager's face turned pale almost instantly. His shoulders stiffened. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Around them, the kitchen staff exchanged stunned glances. One of the line cooks quietly lowered his eyes toward the floor, while another employee slowly stepped backward in disbelief. Clara remained frozen beside the trash bin, still clutching the edge of her worn cardigan. "Mr. Callaway," Richard finally whispered. Ethan slipped the card calmly back into his jacket pocket. "Interesting," he said quietly. "A few seconds ago, I was just someone who did not understand hospitality standards." Richard swallowed hard. "Sir, I did not realize." "No," Ethan interrupted calmly. "You realized exactly what you wanted to realize." The kitchen went silent again. Richard immediately straightened his tie, his entire demeanor changing in seconds. Cold arrogance disappeared from his face almost magically, replaced by nervous professionalism. "I sincerely apologize if my handling of the situation appeared inappropriate." Ethan looked at him steadily. Appeared inappropriate. Richard's forehead glistened slightly now beneath the harsh overhead light. "I was simply trying to maintain company policy." Ethan turned toward the untouched catering trays again. "By humiliating an employee over food headed for the dumpster?" Richard quickly forced a weak smile. "Of course, that was never my intention." Clara stood motionless nearby, clearly uncomfortable with all attention suddenly centered on her. Ethan noticed immediately. Even now, after everything, she looked more worried about causing trouble than protecting herself. That alone said more about her character than any employee evaluation ever could. Ethan looked back toward Richard. What is Clara's record here? Richard blinked once. Sir, her employee record. Richard hesitated. She has never received formal disciplinary action. Attendance. Excellent. Guest complaints. None. Ethan nodded slowly. So the employee you publicly embarrassed tonight is one of your most reliable workers. Richard's silence answered everything. Ethan walked slowly toward the prep station now, his polished shoes echoing softly against the tile floor. Do you know what destroys companies? He asked quietly. Richard stood stiffly. No, sir. Ethan glanced around the kitchen. Not competition. Not market crashes. Not even bad investments. His eyes settled on Clara for one brief moment. It is when people with authority forget how to treat human beings. A hush fell across the room. Clara lowered her gaze immediately, visibly overwhelmed by the situation unfolding around her. Ethan noticed the exhaustion in her posture more clearly now. The 16-hour shift. The hunger. The quiet embarrassment of being caught trying to save bread for her sick mother. And despite all of it, she still had not complained once. Richard cleared his throat carefully. Sir, I can assure you this matter will be corrected immediately. Ethan faced him again. It already should have been. Richard nodded rapidly now. Absolutely. Ethan studied him silently for several long seconds before speaking again. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, I want a full report on employee meal policies, overtime practices, and overnight staffing conditions for this property. Richard's voice nearly cracked. Yes, sir. And another thing. Richard straightened instantly. Yes, sir. Ethan's expression hardened slightly for the first time all night. Nobody working 16 hours in one of my hotels should ever feel ashamed for eating. The words landed heavily across the kitchen. Clara slowly looked up at him, her blue eyes filled not with triumph, but confusion, as though kindness from powerful people felt unfamiliar to her. Ethan turned toward her gently now. Clara. She hesitated. Yes, sir. Ethan pulled the metal chair back toward the table for her. And take the bread home to your mother. Richard immediately forced another smile. Of course. Absolutely. Clara, please do not worry about the food. Ethan glanced toward him sharply. She was never the problem. Richard lowered his eyes instantly. Clara slowly returned to the chair, still visibly stunned. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down again beside the cold plate of leftovers. Ethan noticed she still looked hesitant to touch the food. Years of humiliation do not disappear in one conversation. Then quietly, without another word, Ethan reached for a clean plate from the prep counter, transferred the untouched steak onto it himself, and placed it gently in front of her. The billionaire owner of one of America's largest luxury hotel chains stood silently beneath fluorescent kitchen lights, serving dinner to an exhausted housekeeping employee, while the overnight manager watched in speechless shame. Some people spend their entire lives chasing status, only to discover too late that the people they look down on possessed more class than they ever will. Clara sat quietly at the small metal table, staring at the warm plate Ethan had prepared for her himself. The steam rising from the steak seemed almost unreal after hours spent cleaning luxury suites she could never afford to enter as a guest. Around her, the kitchen staff remained frozen in stunned silence. Nobody in the Callaway Grand had ever seen Ethan Callaway inside the employee kitchen before, much less standing beside a housekeeping worker in the middle of the night. Richard Holloway cleared his throat nervously, desperate to recover control of the situation. Sir, perhaps we should continue this discussion privately in your office. Ethan did not even look at him. His attention remained on Clara. Did you clock out already? Clara shook her head softly. Not yet. What time did your shift start? 10 this morning. Ethan slowly glanced at the clock above the prep station. It was nearly 2:30 in the morning. More than 16 hours. Richard quickly stepped in again. We have had staffing shortages all month. Richard opened his mouth slightly, then stopped. No answer came. Ethan walked toward the industrial coffee machine near the counter and poured hot coffee into a paper cup before placing it beside Clara's plate. Cream or sugar? Clara looked overwhelmed. Black is fine. Ethan nodded once. My mother drank hers black too. For a brief second, something softened in Clara's eyes. Ethan noticed it immediately. She reminded him too much of the women he grew up around. Women who survived quietly while the world barely noticed them. Women who stretched groceries across impossible weeks and still apologized whenever they needed help. Richard stood stiffly near the doorway now, visibly sweating beneath the fluorescent lights. The confident manager who had mocked Clara over leftovers only minutes earlier looked like a completely different man. Fear had replaced arrogance. Ethan finally faced him again. How many overnight staff members skip meals because they cannot afford cafeteria prices? Richard blinked rapidly. Sir, I do not monitor employee personal finances. Maybe you should, Ethan replied coldly. The room fell silent again. One of the younger kitchen workers lowered his eyes quickly to hide a faint smile. For the first time all night, somebody powerful was saying what employees had whispered privately for years. Ethan stepped closer toward Richard now. Do you know why I visit my hotels without warning? Richard swallowed hard. To evaluate operations, sir. No. Ethan's voice remained calm, but heavier now. Because executives lie during scheduled inspections. Richard's face tightened immediately. Ethan continued slowly. Managers smile. Staff become nervous. Reports get polished. Everybody performs. His eyes swept across the exhausted kitchen workers surrounding him. But after midnight, he paused briefly. That is when the truth shows itself. A hush settled over the room. Clara quietly lowered her fork, listening now like everyone else. Ethan looked directly at Richard. Tonight I saw a woman who worked 16 hours feel ashamed for eating discarded food, while management worried about appearances instead of human beings. Richard's voice came out barely above a whisper. I understand, sir. Ethan shook his head once. No, you understand consequences. That is different. The words landed like stone. Clara glanced toward Richard briefly, but there was no satisfaction in her face. Only discomfort. Even after being humiliated, she still looked saddened watching another person fall apart publicly. Ethan noticed that too. Compassion without bitterness. It was becoming impossible not to admire her. Then suddenly Clara spoke softly. Please do not fire him because of me. Every head turned toward her instantly. Richard looked stunned. Ethan stared at her carefully. Clara folded her hands together nervously. People make mistakes when they are stressed. Richard looked at her in disbelief. This woman had every reason to hate him right now. Yet she was protecting him instead. Ethan slowly exhaled through his nose. The room had gone completely still. Then quietly, almost to himself, Ethan said, That right there is the difference between power and character. Clara looked down immediately, embarrassed by the attention. Ethan walked back toward the table and noticed the small plastic pharmacy receipt sticking partially out of her worn handbag. He glanced at the total accidentally. $487.62. Medication expenses. Suddenly everything made sense. The exhaustion. The leftovers. The carefully saved bread. The 16-hour shifts. Ethan looked at Clara again, but this time something deeper settled into his expression. Pity. Respect. Real respect. And at that exact moment, Ethan Calloway quietly decided that before sunrise, Clara Bennett's life was going to change forever. True wealth is revealed by what a person notices when nobody else is looking. The kitchen slowly emptied after Ethan's final words settled over the room like quiet thunder. One by one, the overnight staff returned to their stations in stunned silence, though whispers immediately spread through the service hallways of the Calloway Grand. The owner himself had just defended a housekeeping employee over discarded food. Nobody could remember anything like it ever happening before. Richard Holloway lingered awkwardly near the doorway, still pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Ethan finally looked toward him. You may leave now. Richard nodded quickly. Yes, sir. But before turning away, he glanced once toward Clara. Shame flickered visibly across his face for the first time that night. Ms. Bennett, he hesitated awkwardly. I apologize. Clara looked startled by the words. It is okay. Richard lowered his eyes briefly before disappearing down the hallway without another sound. The moment he left, the tension inside the kitchen shifted completely. The harsh pressure that had filled the room all night seemed to dissolve into exhausted quiet. Clara slowly set down her fork again. You did not have to do that for me. Ethan leaned against the prep counter beside her. Yes, I did. Clara shook her head gently. Most people in your position would not even notice someone like me. Ethan stared at her for a moment before answering softly. That is probably the problem. The rain outside had begun slowing now, soft drops sliding down the dark kitchen windows, while distant thunder rolled faintly across the sleeping city. Somewhere upstairs, The ballroom staff vacuumed expensive carpets beneath crystal chandeliers, while Chicago traffic glowed beyond the hotel skyline. But down here beneath fluorescent lights and humming refrigerators, something more important was happening. Ethan pulled out the metal chair across from Clara again and sat down quietly. No billionaire posture. No executive performance. Just a tired man suddenly remembering where he came from. Clara looked uncertain. Why are you really down here tonight? Ethan gave a faint smile without humor. I ask myself that a lot lately. Clara waited quietly. Ethan rested his forearms against the table. I built hotels because when I was a kid, places like this looked magical. His eyes drifted briefly toward the hallway leading back upstairs. Perfect lighting. Perfect music. Perfect service. I thought luxury meant happiness. Clara listened carefully now. Ethan exhaled slowly. Then one day you wake up surrounded by people pretending constantly. He gave a faint tired laugh. Investors pretending to care. Executives pretending to listen. Guests pretending they are important because they paid for expensive suites. Clara looked down at her plate thoughtfully. Maybe people are just lonely. Ethan blinked once, surprised by the simplicity of the answer. Clara folded the napkin carefully in her hands. Lonely people usually try hardest to look important. The billionaire stared at her in silence. Again, she spoke with quiet wisdom that sounded nothing like the education level listed in a housekeeping employee file. No bitterness. No resentment. Just observation born from hardship. Ethan found himself asking softly, "What did you want to be before all this?" Clara smiled faintly for the first time all night. A real smile this time. Small, but genuine. A nurse. Ethan nodded slowly. What happened? She looked down at the coffee beside her. Life happened. The words landed softly, but heavily. Ethan knew there was an entire untold story inside that sentence alone. Student loans perhaps. Family illness. Financial collapse. Dreams postponed until survival became more urgent than ambition. Clara glanced toward the clock above the kitchen entrance. Nearly 3 in the morning now. I should probably finish my floor assignments. Ethan frowned slightly. You are still working? Clara nodded. The East Wing suites need turnover before breakfast arrivals. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. After 16 hours. After humiliation. After everything tonight. She was still thinking about unfinished work responsibilities. Ethan slowly stood from the table. Me. Clara looked confused. Where? Ethan grabbed his suit jacket from the chair. To the executive floor. Her eyes widened immediately. I cannot go up there looking like this. Ethan glanced at her housekeeping uniform, the worn cardigan, the exhaustion she seemed suddenly ashamed of again. Then he said quietly, Clara, tonight you are the only person in this building who has nothing to be embarrassed about. The room went silent. Clara lowered her eyes instantly, visibly emotional now for the first time all night. Ethan noticed the tears threatening carefully behind them, even though she fought hard not to let them fall. Then, without another word, the billionaire owner opened the kitchen door himself and waited for her to walk out first. The people who carry the greatest dignity are usually the ones the world forced to survive without comfort. Clara walked beside Ethan through the quiet employee corridor with hesitant steps, clutching her worn handbag tightly against her side. The fluorescent lighting faded behind them as they approached the private executive elevators leading toward the upper floors of the Callaway Grand. Every instinct inside her told her she did not belong there. Housekeeping staff did not ride executive elevators at 3 in the morning beside billionaire owners. They cleaned around luxury. They stayed invisible inside it. Ethan pressed the elevator button calmly, while Clara kept her eyes lowered toward the polished marble floor. Her housekeeping shoes looked painfully out of place beside his expensive Italian leather dress shoes. She noticed it immediately. Ethan noticed that she noticed. You are thinking about your shoes, he said quietly. Clara looked embarrassed. I probably should not be walking through guest areas dressed like this. Ethan glanced toward her worn cardigan and tired uniform. Do you know what I see? Clara shook her head slightly. Someone who worked harder today than half the people attending that gala upstairs. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Clara hesitated before stepping inside beside him. Mirrors lined the walls of the elevator, forcing her to see herself clearly beneath the soft golden lighting. Exhausted eyes, wrinkled uniform, hair falling loose after 16 hours of labor. Beside her stood Ethan Callaway, calm and composed even after midnight, his tailored navy suit still sharp despite the long evening. The contrast between them looked almost unreal. Yet somehow Ethan seemed far less comfortable than she did. The elevator climbed silently toward the executive floors while rain streaked across the massive glass windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Finally, Clara spoke softly. "Why are you being kind to me?" Ethan kept his eyes forward. "Because somebody should have been a long time ago." Clara stared at him quietly. The answer sounded too honest to be rehearsed, too personal to be polite. When the elevator doors opened again, Clara stepped into a world she had only seen while cleaning after wealthy guests left. Clara instinctively slowed her pace. Ethan noticed immediately. "You still feel like you do not belong here," he said gently. Clara gave a faint, nervous smile. "People like me usually do not." Ethan looked directly at her now. "People like you built places like this." The hallway fell silent. Clara looked away quickly, visibly emotional again. Ethan walked toward a set of dark oak double doors at the end of the corridor and opened them carefully. Clara froze the moment she saw the office beyond. The executive suite looked more like a private penthouse than a workplace. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the skyline, while shelves lined with business awards reflected warm amber lighting throughout the room. A massive fireplace glowed quietly beside leather chairs overlooking the city. Clara stepped inside carefully, almost afraid to touch anything. Ethan removed his suit jacket and draped it across a chair before loosening his tie completely. For the first time that night, he looked less like a billionaire executive and more like a tired man carrying years of pressure alone. "Sit down," he said gently. Clara hesitated before lowering herself carefully onto the edge of a leather chair that probably cost more than her car. Ethan crossed toward a small refrigerator near the office bar area and removed 2 bottled waters. He handed one to her before sitting across from her near the windows overlooking the city lights below. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely peaceful after the tension downstairs. Finally, Ethan looked toward her handbag resting beside the chair. "Your mother's medication," he said quietly. Clara stiffened slightly. "I did not mean to pry earlier." She looked down at the bottle of water in her hands. "It is okay." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "How sick is she?" Clara took a slow breath before answering. "Congestive heart failure." Ethan's expression softened immediately. Clara continued quietly. "The surgeries helped for a while, but the medication costs keep increasing." She forced a small smile that did not fully hide the exhaustion beneath it. "Extra shifts whenever I can." Ethan stared out toward the skyline for a long moment. Then softly he asked, "And who takes care of you, Clara?" The question caught her completely off guard. Her eyes widened slightly as though nobody had asked her that in years. The room went silent except for distant thunder rolling across the sleeping city outside. Clara looked down at her hands again, unable to answer. Because the truth was simple. Nobody had. Sometimes the most important moment in a person's life is not when somebody gives them money, but when somebody finally sees their pain without looking away. Clara sat quietly in the leather chair near the office windows, her hands wrapped gently around the unopened bottle of water while Chicago's skyline shimmered beneath the rain outside. Ethan's question still hung softly in the air between them. "Who takes care of you, Clara?" She lowered her eyes slowly. "I do not really think about that anymore." Ethan leaned back in silence, studying her carefully. There was no self-pity in her voice, no dramatic sadness, just the exhausted honesty of someone who had spent too many years surviving without expecting comfort from anyone. Clara gave a faint smile. "My mother needs me. That is enough." Ethan looked toward the glowing city below for a long moment before speaking again. "My mother used to say something similar." Clara glanced up quietly. Ethan folded his hands together. "She worked 3 jobs when I was growing up. Motel cleaning during the day, diner shifts at night, laundry service on weekends." A faint bittersweet smile crossed his face. "Every time I asked when she was going to rest, she would say, 'Later. Right now people need me.'" Clara listened silently. Ethan exhaled softly. "She died before she ever reached later." The room went still. Clara's expression softened immediately. For the first time that night, she saw something fragile behind Ethan Calloway's calm composure. Not power, grief. The kind that success never fully heals. Ethan stared quietly toward the rain streaking across the massive windows. "That is why tonight bothered me so much." Clara said nothing. Ethan looked back at her. "I spent years building these hotels because I thought success meant escaping the life I came from." His eyes drifted downward briefly. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing the people still trapped inside it. Clara looked startled. Ethan ended the call and turned back toward her. Tomorrow, employee meal programs change company-wide. Clara blinked. Because of me? Ethan shook his head. Because this should have happened years ago. He walked back toward the chair across from her. No employee working overnight shifts in my hotels will ever pay for cafeteria meals again. Clara stared at him speechlessly. Ethan continued quietly. Mandatory overtime reviews start immediately. Additional overnight staffing too. Paused briefly before adding. And medical assistance resources for employees caring for sick family members. The room went silent except for the soft rain outside. Clara looked completely overwhelmed now. You cannot change an entire company because one housekeeper got embarrassed tonight. Ethan's expression softened. No, he shook his head gently. I am changing it because one exhausted woman reminded me what kind of company I wanted to build before money complicated everything. Clara lowered her eyes instantly, visibly emotional again. Ethan noticed tears finally slipping quietly down her cheeks despite her attempts to hide them. Not dramatic tears. Just silent exhaustion finally cracking after carrying too much alone for too long. Ethan handed her a box of tissues from the desk without saying a word. Clara laughed softly through tears, embarrassed. I am sorry. Do not apologize for being tired, Ethan replied gently. The room fell quiet again. Then Ethan reached into his jacket pocket slowly and removed a business card before placing it carefully on the table beside her. Clara looked down at it. Beneath Ethan Calloway's name was a handwritten number. What is this? She asked softly. Direct access to my office. Clara looked confused. Ethan smiled faintly. Your mother's medication should never depend on whether leftovers survive the trash. Clara froze completely. Mr. Calloway, I cannot accept charity. Ethan shook his head immediately. Good. His voice remained calm and steady. Because I am not offering charity. He looked directly at her now. I am investing in someone who never stopped being kind, even when life gave her every reason to become bitter. The room went silent once more. Outside, dawn slowly began softening the dark Chicago skyline with pale blue morning light. For the first time in years, Clara Bennett no longer looked invisible. And as Ethan watched the exhausted housekeeper quietly wipe tears from her face beneath the warm office lights, the billionaire finally understood something wealth had never taught him. Dignity was not found in penthouses, luxury cars, or million-dollar galas. Sometimes dignity looked like a tired woman saving a dinner roll for her sick mother at 2 in the morning while the rest of the world looked away.